Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Mexican Independence, and we're going to talk about the process of achieving independence for the nation of Mexico. And we're going to do so by introducing 5 terms that, if you're really not familiar with this particular topic, it's good to start using these terms or thinking about these terms as a way to then go do more research about this really kind of fascinating part of the history of Mexico. All right, so let's get into it. The first term for us is terms. All right, so I think especially if you grew up in the US, I think especially potentially if you maybe look a little bit like I do, that sometimes when it comes to thinking about, and if you don't know a lot about independence in Mexico, that sometimes different terms can get conflated when it comes to thinking about Mexican independence. So that when we're thinking about Mexican independence, what we're talking about is that process that begins in 1810 and culminates in 1821 and involves a number of factors. We're not talking about the revolution that occurs in 1910. That's one part of this. So Mexican independence and the revolution, those are kind of 2 separate things. Secondly, this doesn't have anything to do with Cinco de Mayo. Okay? It doesn't have anything to do with Cinco de Mayo. All right? Cinco de Mayo has to do with success in a battle against the French much later. So this doesn't have anything to do with Cinco de Mayo. All right? Point 2, French invasion. So the fact that independence in Mexico gets its start around 1810 and lasts for about a dozen years, part of that timing has to do with the fact that in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the French military attempts a process, largely under Napoleon Bonaparte by the time you get to about 1799, to engage in a series of European-wide wars. By 1808, they invade Spain. And in the process of taking it over, you're going to see a great deal of political upheaval within the Spanish kingdom. And one of the things that occurs there is not only do you have a real violent insurgency against the presence of French troops and French military authority in Spain, but you're also going to have efforts on the part of regions across Spain develop new forms of government, which in some cases would ultimately serve as inspirations for both the nation of Mexico and for many of the nations across Latin America, which at that point were colonies of Spain. A good example of this would be, of course, what's called the Cortes or Constitution of Cadiz, which comes in around 1811, 1812. This more representative form of government, more democratic form of government in a way, is what will inspire some of the revolutionaries, some of those who are seeking independence in Mexico within that specific time period. This brings us to our third term, Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla. So Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla was a priest, and he was really, really important at his parish at Dolores in September the 16th in 1810 in helping to formalize a clear statement, a vocalization of unrest, a vocalization of real frustration on the part of the public in Mexico against the Spanish authority and against this authority. Now, this will lead to a broad insurgency. There will be conflict. There will be attacks against civilians. Eventually, Hidalgo y Castilla is captured and he's executed in 1811. But it's his efforts, his initial efforts in September of 1810, and who he's working with and who supported him, which will eventually lead to kind of the formalization of an insurgency and a war for independence within Mexico against royal authorities And the kind of the formalization of what these individuals wanted doesn't really take place till about 1813, and when it does, right, it includes independence, and so this really kind of gets the process of opposition moving, and this idea of Mexican identity sort of moving forward. This brings us to our fourth term, which is the Plan of Iguala, or the Three Guarantees. And this comes to us in the year 1821. So you'd had an insurgency in this series of battles against royal authority within Mexico for nearly a decade. And you had a number of different generals who were leading different armies who were committed to pushing back against royal authority. Well, the plan, as well as the Army of the Three Guarantees, was a process whereby they came together. So the plan involved creating a new government for an independent Mexico. This would involve a constitutional monarchy. We're talking, figures here, Vicente Guerrero. We're talking Augustin Iturbide, right? We're talking a number of these individuals. And this is a process that will lead eventually to some of the Spanish royal forces leaving, colonial forces leaving, the Treaty of Cordoba. But of course, the Spanish government doesn't fully recognize this. The Spanish government has their own difficulties, and this leads us to something called, and this is our fifth term, the Battle of Tampico. Now, the Battle of Tampico is a process. It takes place between July and September of 1829. Essentially, what you've got is a Mexican nation that has declared itself to be independent, has declared its sense of self, has its own military, its ability to defend its own sovereignty, and the Spanish government basically says no. And what you end up having is a conflict where Spanish forces and royalist forces are still trying to essentially come back into modern Mexico, come back in and take it over. And Mexican forces kind of surround the Spanish and are able to defeat them here in this battle. And it's kind of the last major engagement, between these two kinds of forces. And again, this is in 1829. The Spanish government will eventually recognize the independence of Mexico, but that's not going to be until about 1836. So that takes quite a while. All right. Thanks so much.